We're going to talk a little bit today about Salt SSH. Hopefully my screensaver doesn't kick in again during the talk. How many of you guys have used Salt SSH before? A handful, not very many. How many of you guys use SSH on a regular basis for administrating computers? Okay, how about Salt instead? Okay. I don't know why all your hands didn't go up for Salt. I mean, this is the place, right? So let's talk a little bit first about the differences between Salt and Salt SSH. Okay. So there's the classic Salt. We run the Salt command. You know, you've got minions connected to a master. They've got this key thing going on. They're always connected, right? Whereas SSH, you SSH in, you run a command or commands, and you log out, and then later on you might log in again and do stuff again, and so on. So you issue the Salt command. We just talked about that. There's a lot of people that are they're used to SSH. I mean, it's been around for a while, and even before it was around, there was Telnet, which was basically the same thing, except people spied on you, right? In fact, really, when it comes down to it, everything runs on Telnet. But I mean, it's the backbone of everything, but Salt SSH adds a layer of encryption. Other things add their own layers, their own protocols on top of it. So it makes sense that people are used to running SSH. And in fact, it's been so ingrained in the system that we have things that depend on SSH, right? So it made sense after a while to put together an SSH version of Salt, which I don't know if you recognize that second logo there. Really the problem with this is that Salt SSH has already lasted way longer than New Coke, and probably have more people who use it. So, and seriously, I'm going to get a t-shirt of that first one. Okay, so first of all, when you're starting off, there's a couple things to remember. You need Python 2.6 or higher on the remote system. Okay, just like the master, or I'm sorry, just like a regular Salt machine needs Python 2.6, we are technically running Salt on the remote system as well, so it's going to have the same system requirements. Unless you're sending raw commands, which we'll get to at the end of this talk. Now, depending on your platform, you may need to install the Salt SSH package separately from the Salt master package. Some platforms you just install Salt and you get everything. Some platforms you install this, then you install this, and then you install this. You know, most of those have also like a Salt common package and so on, right? So you may need to install that separately on the master, not on the remote machines or anything. Okay. Salt SSH is a standalone application. It doesn't require the Salt master to be running. In fact, I'm not running it on my system, and we'll be doing a handful of commands on my system. In fact, I don't think it even needs the Salt master installed, but it'll need Salt common installed, of course. Okay, questions so far? Okay. So Salt, it has this kind of pub-sub thing where the master is running a service that the minions all subscribe to. And when the master needs to issue a command, it publishes that to that bus. And the minion or minions that need to pick up that command, they're subscribed, they'll see that command, and they'll issue the command and they'll return the return data, right? In fact, really, the master doesn't even need to know the minions' addresses in this scenario. The minions need to know where the master is, but it's not the master that's connecting directly to the minions, it's the other way around, okay? Salt SSH doesn't do that because SSH doesn't do that, right? It needs to know what the addresses are for the machines that it's going to be connecting to. And so in Salt, that map that connects them all is called the roster, okay? Let's talk about some of the rosters that are that are used by default. The big one is a flat file, okay? Meaning there's no extra service or anything. You just drop it inside etc salt roster, or you can put a number of files inside etc salt roster.d, and they'll all be picked up, and they'll all have information about these minions that we're connecting to. We'll see that file in just a moment. You can configure the location for that roster in other places as well. You do this normally in the etc salt master file. Even if you don't have the master installed, that's still where the configuration for Salt SSH is going to be. Roster file is a single destination, a path to the roster. So for instance, etc salt roster, opt salt, my roster stuff, etc. And you can also point to rosters as a list of directories. In fact, this should probably do files too. I don't know. If anyone wants to test, go for it. I still just use, in fact, I don't really use the flat roster a whole lot. I use the external rosters, the dynamic rosters, and we'll get to those in a moment. If you're running a per command roster, meaning sometimes you want to use one roster, sometimes you want to use a different roster, depending on your use case, you can actually just specify which file to use on the command line and point to that directly. I can imagine, say, setting up an alias for Salt SSH -- roster file and assign it to, let's see, SS web stuff. And that automatically adds on the roster file, for instance. Questions so far? Okay. Either I'm explaining it really well, or you guys are embarrassed to raise your hand and talk to me. I mean, I would be too. So I wouldn't blame you. So looking inside the roster file, there's a few different ways you can do this. Now, first off, this file is in YAML. Do we all know YAML? Raise your hand if you don't know YAML. Okay, for those of you that don't know YAML, here's a really quick overview of YAML. It's a dictionary, and the values in that dictionary can be another dictionary. They can be a string, or they can be a list. And the list can be a string, or a dictionary, or list, and so on, right? So in this case, we have a key called will. We have one named Dart. Bonus points if anyone figures this out. Dart is short for D'Artagnan. We have a key called Demogorgon. And we have one called Demodog. I'm seeing smiles. That makes me happy. I've been having a hard time finding people to talk to about the new season. So as far as the key and value thing is concerned, you guys can see that there with will. The key is will. The value is 10.0.0.50. And then we have Demogorgon, where the key is Demogorgon and the value is a list. That's what the dashes are for, of, again, dictionaries, host, user, and password, right? So first off, a classic example. This is assuming that the user is already set up either in your SSH configuration file, or it's just using the same user that you're running Salt SSH on. And maybe you already have your keys set up already. If you've got everything set up so you just need a host name, then you could just say the host name. And that's what we've done with Will and Dart. Demogorgon, we needed to do a little bit more. We needed to specify not only the host name. By the way, this can be numbers or host names, just in case that's not clear. We have a host name set up, and then we have a different user. The Demogorgon is the faceless guy, right? And he's controlled by the mind flayer. So his password is Flayer Minion. Or we also have a Demodog set up. A different host name. We've got a path on the system running Salt SSH to the key that's going to be used to log into the remote machine, right? And sudo is whether or not you need to use the sudo, add sudo to the beginning of your commands to issue a command as root. Does that make sense? So if you're running root, if you're SSHing into the root user on the remote machine, then obviously you don't need that. Who SSHs into root on the remote machine? Put your hands down. I'm embarrassed for you. We shouldn't do it, but we do it, right? So you're probably going to be SSHing in as a user that may or may not have sudo access. And it could be that you're just running unprivileged commands anyway, in which case you don't even need sudo. Or you could have a privileged user set up, one with sudo access, and have him issue root commands via that command. Okay, let's set up a roster real quick. So again, we're going to do etc salt roster. Okay. And let's go ahead and set up the demo Gorgon. Okay. And I'm lazy and didn't set up a cloud machine or anything, so that's just going to be localhost. Okay. We with me so far? So we'll go ahead and hop on out of there and do a Salt SSH demo Gorgon. Did I spell it right in the roster? What? Oh, good. Okay, and then we'll just do a test.ping, right? The most basic of basics. Oh, problem, right? What's the problem here? I have root locked out on my machine for SSH, right? As well, we all should. But again, circumstances, right? So let's go ahead and open up that roster file again. Let's go ahead and do it over here. And let's change this. So the host is still going to be localhost. Okay. The user is going to be demo dog. Okay. And this is super secret. Nobody write this down, okay? Good, nobody's writing it down. So the password is in Milat. And so I'll go ahead and back out of there. And let's just keep 2 windows going. How about that? We'll issue our command again. Ignore that warning. I don't know why it's doing it. But I do a lot of weird stuff with Salt on my machine, so it's probably my fault. In fact, there's a 99% chance that it's my fault. So anyway, we issue that command and it comes back with true. Obviously, we're never going to use passwords, right? We have that turned off at SSH, right? Just nod yes. Okay, so I have a key set up. And I can never remember this full number, you know? So we'll go back over here, and instead of password, we'll point it to a private key. And that's in root.ssh/id add 25519, okay? And I could say sudo is true, but I don't trust the demo dog for some reason, so I don't. Okay, we issue our command. It's taking a while. That's a key that I just set up for that user. Demo Gorgon, you notice that it takes a little bit longer than it would in Salt because SSH has a little bit more overhead. I mean, SSH, it's a tunnel application, right? The default application of which happens to be Telnet, but there's other things we can run through that tunnel, like X11 forwarding and so on. If you got bored, you could run Apache through it and connect to it over. Anyway, and so it's got a lot more overhead. Whereas Salt, it does one thing: the masters talk to minions, right? So there's a lot but less overhead, but so it's going to take a little bit more time. And honestly, I don't know why it's so slow on my machine, but I run a million apps, so that's probably why. I could never have enough memory. Okay, so questions so far on the flat files? Yes, back first.
How would you go about setting up a reverse SSH tunnel?
So the question is, how would you go about setting up a reverse SSH tunnel? This is going to go in with other things, like you can cache the SSH connection as well. These are things you're going to do outside of Salt SSH. There's no direct support for them inside of Salt SSH. As far as, have you guys ever cached your SSH connection before? So you basically connect to the remote machine and then store that connection so that any subsequent connections to that machine just go over a pre-existing connection, which cuts out a lot of the overhead and is theoretically much faster. Guess what? My connection is cached. And it's over localhost. What?
Mosh?
Not Mosh. You can do it with OpenSSH. I don't have the command right here, but I can give it to you afterwards if you want. Or I'm going to give a chainless promotion at the end, in which you can also find that. It's my right?
Yeah.
Okay. Did that answer your question? Okay. Over here? Just you. Okay, go ahead.
On the slide, you have the options as a list, but when you did the roster, it's just emailing.
Oh, you're right. Guys, my slides are wrong. I'll fix them and re-upload them, okay? You're right. It's not a list. It's just a dictionary inside there. Thank you. So there's other rosters that are built in. The default is just going to use the flat files, etc. Salt roster, etc. But there's also, for instance, a scan roster. What this does is you give it a range of IP addresses, and it will scan those addresses. And if you have credentials set up, like your username and password, which you can pass on the command line too, or your SSH keys are already set up, then it will find those machines, and it will log in, and it will issue whatever command it is you want to run. Okay? Who has machines set up that can be identified via a scan like that? Okay, nobody raise your hands. Good, good, okay. But if you happen to be that sort of person, and really inside a locked down environment, an environment that's disconnected from the internet, then you might see that quite a bit more than you would with something that has public IPs, right? Hopefully you don't have anything with public IPs doing this. So, and you guys can see the basic idea behind how the scan roster works. You pass it a range and it goes, okay? We have the cache roster. Who here has worked with the Salt cache? I'm not talking about the job cache. I'm not talking about the mine. I'm not even talking about the cloud cache or the cache subsystem. There's a lot of caches in Salt. As it turns out, every time you issue a command using Salt, it is going to cache information from that minion on the master. The big thing that we're worried about is grains, because it's a lot faster to pull grains from the master than to ask the minion for it each time. But there's other data that can also be cached. And one of those pieces of data is an IP address or a host name. And so if you tell it to use the cache and then just give it the name of a minion, then it will go to the Salt cache, look for that minion, look inside that minion's cached data for an IP address, and then SSH to it. You guys see any use cases for that? Here's one. Something weird happened to Salt on the remote machine, and you can't get to it anymore, and so you want to issue an SSH command over Salt SSH. Right? Of course, we don't run across that problem anymore. Salt is perfectly stable. Don't laugh. Okay. There's also a cloud cache. Who here uses Salt Cloud? Okay, there's like 4 embarrassed people. Okay, so here's the thing with Salt Cloud. Cloud has its own cache as well. When Salt Cloud spins up a machine, it collects information about that machine. Once it's spun up, there's return data, and that return data is going to include the host name or IP address that Salt Cloud itself used to log in and provision that machine, right? Salt Cloud is going to hang on to that data by default, and if you tell it to use the cloud roster, then same kind of thing, it's just going to look at a different cache than the other one. Make sense? Okay. And who here uses Ansible? Put your hands down. Okay, so for those of you that use Ansible, I mean, Ansible is a big deal, right? I'm sure we know a lot of people that have migrated from Ansible, right? We don't know anyone that actually uses it currently. They've just migrated. Okay, I thought it was funny. What's that? They're in the process of it. Whatever the deal is, if you've been in an Ansible world, you probably have Ansible inventories that are basically the Ansible version of a cloud roster, or of a Salt SSH roster. And you can read those files natively. So you just say roster equals Ansible, you point it over to that file, whatever it happens to be, and issue your same Salt SSH commands as usual. Okay, questions so far? Okay. So, targeting. We all know about targeting in Salt, right? What's the basic, what's the one target that we all know how to use? Like the first thing we ever learn when we start learning Salt? What? Asterisk, star, right? And what is that? What type of target? Glob. You guys cheated, right? So you can do the glob, that's the normal one, and really with a glob, my minion name or demo gorgon or whatever, that's just, it's a glob that doesn't happen to have any wildcards, but you could do demo star, and it would pull up both demo gorgon and demo dog, right? You can do a Perl compatible regular expression. Who here still uses PCREs? It's okay, don't be embarrassed. I was a Perl guy. There's a lot of good reasons to use PCREs. There's not a whole lot of people that use them anymore, but those that still do can do some really powerful things with them. And I usually only see this kind of targeting in shell scripts, other things that are calling Salt, but there's good reasons for PCREs. So if you want to use that, do a -E. Why is it -E? Because that's what it is in grep. I think Tom was going to call it something else, and I convinced him otherwise. I'm not sure if he appreciates that or not. List. So we're talking like at the bottom, we've got a list of will and dart. So we're SSHing into both of those machines. We're issuing a test.ping, right? Node groups. Anyone here use node groups? Okay. Who here uses Salt? Raise your hand. Internally, when you use Salt, everything is a node group. However, defining your own node groups was never that big, and it's not nearly as big as if it ever was, right? But you can issue a node group. Basically, you define a list of minions inside the master configuration as a node group, and you just point to those. A range. You can specify a range outside of the scan roster. Kind of feels like the same thing to me. Maybe there's a difference. Anyway, a range of IP addresses, insider format. And again, with so many things in Salt SSH, the usage is exactly the same thing as in Salt. I mean, we don't want you to try and relearn another steering wheel for a command that does effectively the same thing, right? So, questions so far in targeting? We're all good? Okay. Other options that are available. Who here has used --out with Salt? Does the same thing. Okay. In fact, let's take a look at this. We're going to get that annoying warning again. So, yeah. Exciting, right? Has anyone written an XML outputter yet? Good, I like you guys. I don't think it's ever going to show up, honestly. And then if you remember that master cache I talked about where you use the cache roster that has a copy of the IP addresses in there? If you need to refresh that for a minion, so it logs into the minion and redoes the cache, and then logs in the minion over Salt SSH again, add a -- refresh. Okay? Questions? I'm trying to ask for questions on every slide, so even the short ones. Salt file. Who here has used Salt file? I saw a hand go halfway up and go down. So salt file is one of those things that nobody knows about, but it's kind of cool. You can put a file called salt file with a capital S inside a directory, and when you issue a salt command or a salt SSH command, and I think even Salt Cloud supports it, and I'm sure others do too, then it will take configuration from that file. It's in the same format as a salt master file. It'll update the master configuration with it, and it will issue a command using that new configuration. It's going to be in the current working directory of wherever you're issuing the command. So if you happen to be the sort of person that sets up a directory tree just so you can have different salt files, then that would work. I don't think any of us are that type of person, but maybe we are. However, one thing that is kind of common is to point, well, more common than current working directory, is to point to a specific salt file using the -- salt file option. So that's going to add additional options or additional args onto your command. Run it. Okay. Questions? Oh, yes, sir. So the question is whether they merge together or they override. I don't know. I can tell you that the configuration inside of Salt does a lot of dictionary update. And I'm guessing that that's probably what it's using here too. But I can't tell you for sure. I'd have to check the code. And that's probably an exercise that's going to take longer than what we have left. So we can look later if you want. Okay, other questions? How you guys feeling so far? Who's rearing and ready to go with Salt SSH? Okay. Raw mode. So there may be a circumstance in which you want to issue a raw command, meaning a standard SSH command, a not salt command, using Salt SSH. First off, why in the world would you ever do that instead of just using the SSH command? Yes?
Because
it does it on all the servers. So we can specify multiple servers. Good. Anyone else? Multi-threading? I don't know. Sure. Never looked. Anyone else? There's a really big one. Yes? Rosters. Because those rosters are really handy outside of Salt. They map a bunch of stuff to a bunch of machines that you would otherwise have to either do manually or map somewhere else. I guess you can map them in your SSH config files too. But you'd also be missing it out on the other things that are available to you. Now, first off, let's talk about what Salt SSH itself does in non-raw mode. It creates, using a copy of the salt that's installed on the master, it creates a thin file. Okay, it creates a tarball called salt-thin. I think it just used to be called thin.tgz. It's as small as it can get. It packs it up. It logs into the machine. It deploys that file. And then it basically does a salt call -- local using that file. Okay? Have you guys done a salt call -- local? You know what that means? I mean, it's basically, it's issuing salt without talking to the master. Now, it doesn't just pack up salt itself, and I don't remember if it's in that file or a different file. I think it might be in a different file now. It'll actually compile together, say you're doing a state run, or you're doing something else that handles file operations. It will pack up the involved files, the related files, into the tarball, and then transfer that to the remote machine as well. Okay? And then it will disconnect from that machine, and then we'll log in again over just a regular SSH. So it uses SCP for the first one, SSH to issue the command. And then depending on how you have it configured, either it will leave that thin file on there so it doesn't have to upload it again, or it will clean it up when it's done. I think I have set it to clean it up when it's done, which is probably why it takes so long each time. If you let it just leave the file there, it hangs out in /temp/ like username dash some number dash salt, something like that. Anyway, we're not going to go really deep into thin because there is a lot in there that we could get into. That could be another talk on its own. But that's the basic idea of what's going on with Salt SSH. Now, raw commands, you just add in a dash R to your command, and then give it a command as you would. So Salt SSH dash R, minion name, roster options, whatever, and then the command that you're going to issue over your normal SSH command, right? Just as you would do with an SSH-C. Or, I'm sorry, SSH following argument, yeah. Okay. So in this case, we're doing a Salt SSH-R demo Gorgon date. I'm not going to demo it here because it's on the next slide. And the return data is going to look different. When you do non-raw mode, the return data looks like salt data because it's issuing that salt thin command or that salt command using the thin tarball. It's getting data back exactly as it would from salt. It's probably collecting it with dash dash out JSON or something. In fact, I think it does use the JSON one. It pulls that back and just returns that to you using whatever outputter. Since we don't have that format available, it's just going to return to you the standard error, the standard out, and the resulting return code. All in one shot, which is also something that we don't get from just issuing an SSH command, right? Questions on this so far? Okay, we got one guy that's bored already and leaving. Bye. So comparison between these commands. That first one is just a regular salt command. We're doing a command.run, right? And it returns back just the minion dictionary. So this minion, the next minion, and that should say demo dog instead of my minion. I'll fix that too when I upload the slides again. And then the date format as it would come from the date command, right? We issue in raw mode. We get it back a little bit differently. I should probably have outputted this in YAML format, but this is using Salt's default nested outputter. Yes, sir?
I'm assuming the raw mode comes back a lot faster.
Let's find out. Oops. And we'll do a command.run. And obviously, one time is going to tell us everything we need to know, right? First guess is yes. Go ahead and put that in a loop 100 times and see how it acts. You'll have your answer. Okay? Any other questions on this comparison between the two? Okay. I believe that's it, and made good time here. More information can be found, of course, at docs.saltstack.com. Salt SSH help is actually a really good resource. And this is my shameless plug. There's this book out called Mastering SaltStack by some guy. Pretty much all the information in my slides did come from this book, but I only covered about half the information in the Salt SSH chapter from the book. So there's plenty more to learn, and even the book doesn't cover everything. But at the time of its writing, the book did actually have more information on Salt SSH, including internals, than Salt docs themselves. So it was really hard to make that chapter. I came in like 10 pages shy and had to fill it. Yes? Say that again? Can orchestrations do Salt SSH? The short answer is I don't know. Yes. The other answer is yes. Who said yes?
We use it to set up the labs for training.
Oh, apparently we use it to set up the labs for training.
We use build boxes to spin up all the instances, and we use Salt SSH to retie them back to themselves, and then have them spin up the minions for the labs.
Say that again?
So we actually use the raw option.
So they use the raw option.
The raw option to alter the master configuration of the cloud instance. We have a build box in Amazon that spins up our labs for the training. We spin up the masters, and then itself so that we can get away from the build box. And then we issue commands via Salt SSH to the master to then have it use SaltConf to spin up its own minions.
Okay, so my question there, David, is what about using the Salt orchestrator, state.org? That's the question, right?
Oh, yeah, well, that's all inside an orchestration state, because we also put demo files and stuff up there.
So that's inside an orchestration state that's calling it Salt SSH, right? Other way around.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think so. My best guess is no. Because there's going to be too much involved that you'd have to redo over again in the SSH, and it would just, maintaining it would be a nightmare. Okay, anyone else? Yes?
I have a bunch of fairly ancient cloud boxes that I can't put Salt Cloud on because they don't have Python.
Okay.
Salt SSH seems like a reasonable solution to that, but I would like to be able to use, they're on EC2. Is there like some kind of dynamic roster that I can like pull machine flag tag name out of EC2 or something like that?
Maybe. But I don't think there's one in the Salt base. Tell you what, after we're done with Q&A, we've got about 5 minutes left. I'll go ahead and open up a roster roster module. They're very simple. We'll take a look. Okay, any other questions before we do that? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. I don't feel bad if you guys leave, but you can stay too. Okay. Oh, and there's the book. Okay, so these are going to be in the Salt code tree. Salt, rosters, or roster. There's the built-in ones. And let's take a look at scan. See how simple that one is. Okay, so we've got. You don't need a class. I'm going to see if I can find one without a class. I know classes are all the rage in Python, but I think a lot of things are easier to describe without classes. So you notice we got a targets function in there. It accepts, and these are required, it accepts the target type, which by default the target type, if you don't specify it, it's going to be glob, right? But you should probably at least say target type equals glob here. But this is the scan roster, so of course it's going to be a range target type. Remember what I said? I thought they were pretty much the same. This tends to make me think that maybe they are. And then any other arguments you want to pass through. These are minion arguments, salt command arguments. So first off, it looks like we're doing a seco.range.range. Couldn't get away from the classes. So we're importing the seco library. We're using that to figure out our range from the ops. This doesn't look like, yeah, this is a range server. That's not even the same thing at all, guys. I'm sorry. Anyone here use range? Me neither. I'd never even heard of it before I worked for Salt. Let's look at flat. That's probably simple. Flat is its own dynamic roster, by the way. Its own, because it's all pluggable. Were any of you guys in Mike Place's talk earlier about some of the less common Salt modules? Yeah, he really did a really good job talking about those things. So again, we've got our targets function. Looks like we're doing some template compilation. So what does that tell you about the roster files, the flat files? Jinja, right? Or whatevs, whatever is supported by the Salt renderer. So it gets in that roster file, it compiles it. Let's see. Oh, SDB. Mike Place also mentioned SDB. That will dynamically modify the value of whatever the SDB URL is pointed to inside the file and give you something else. So it puts that in there and then it returns a list of targets. So really what we're looking at here, inside the module is something that gives us targets. It doesn't do anything else but tells us what the targets are. And if we look at the rest of the file, these are probably just things that help us figure out what the targets are, right? We good so far?
If I decided I wanted to roll my own by basically just import bottle libraries and, allow myself to, I don't know, on the command line set up parameters for a tag. All IPs of everything with the tag and then spit out a roster format YAML. Would that be the way to go about?
It doesn't even need to return it in properly formatted YAML. It just needs to return a JSON, or I'm sorry, a Python data structure in the same format as the roster file. That's all it needs to return.
So it really wouldn't be all that complex to it.
It is not complicated at all. Even the simplest roster is overcomplicated for how you need to do this. You just need something that returns a roster configuration file. Okay? Questions on this part? Okay, we're done with a little over a minute left, guys. Oh, thank you.